Welcome back, everyone. Michael here with Offshore Citizen. Today I'm going to discuss with you the ultimate plan B. It's a conversation that I've been having with quite a few people lately, reaching out to me because they're concerned about what is going on in the world, whether it's what's happened with Russia and Ukraine or what's happened with Canada and the trucker convoy. There's a lot of people who are looking for backup plans right now. And so from whether you have relatively little in terms of personal resources and want to stay where you're at, or you have a lot of resources, you want to go and move abroad, today I'm going to discuss with you what I share with clients regarding the ultimate plan B in lots of detail. So let's dive in. Before we do, if you haven't already, please hit the subscribe button, hit the all notification bell. If you'd like help with any of the topics that we deal with here, which are setting up citizenships, residencies, international tax optimization, paying the lowest legal amount of tax possible, banking, etc. If you'd like personalized advice, please reach out to me. You can book a call, calendly.com/Michael-Rosmer. There's a link in the description below, or send a message to our websites, offshorecitizen.net and offshorecapitalist.com. Okay, so let's start with the baseline, which is, I think when I think about plan Bs, the main things that I'm thinking about are banking, residencies, citizenships, maybe assets, income streams. Okay, so we're going to talk through the first three in particular because they're the ones that I can most assist you with pretty easily. And then the fourth one I'll touch on a little at the end. Banking. Okay, so here's the deal. Anytime we're thinking about a plan B, what we're thinking about is diversifying ourselves from some sort of uncertainty, and we're putting ourselves in a position where we're basically buying insurance. And the objective of all the insurance we buy is to have low cost insurance. Now, the good news when it comes to bank accounts is it's about the lowest cost insurance you can get. If you think that what's the cost of having a bank account, maybe like 20 bucks a month in account maintenance fees, often much lower, maybe $5, sometimes free today. And as a result, that's pretty good. Now, there's sometimes a little bit of opportunity cost, tying up some cash, and if you don't do it well, you could go and put your money into a situation where it's exposed to some other risk. I heard somebody talking the other day about, if things went bad in this country, it wouldn't be hurting them too much. It's like, but on the other hand, why not put your money and your things in places that it's not likely to hurt you at all, right? So with that in mind, let's talk a little bit about some of the banking options in order of priority. So I've done some previous videos where I've discussed, in my view, the 5 kind of like solid banking options that you can get for non-residents, which would be Singapore, Switzerland, UAE, the US, and Jersey. Okay? Jersey is the Channel Island between UK and France. So if you're willing to put a reasonable amount of money in, these are solid options. And if a person has sufficient net worth, etc., I would encourage you to do all of them if you can. Sometimes there's some limitations, but if you can, do them all. Just because, why not? That you're pretty solidly diversified in that regard, and there's a very low chance that any of these jurisdictions is going to go badly. Now, there are some kind of weird out there sort of diversification plays when it comes to banking that I'll talk about in some future videos. But these ones are, I think, a solid baseline. However, typically when you're looking at these, you're talking about, around, the US is maybe a little bit of an exception, or UAE could be a little bit of an exception if you're a resident. But the others, you're usually talking about some sort of private banking, some sort of wealth management, and as a result, the minimums are fairly high. So if you're looking for some other alternatives, the places that I would typically look at are, first of all, Portugal. Okay, so you can get Portuguese banking as a non-resident pretty easily, even remotely. And would I want to store, tens of millions of dollars in Portuguese banks? No, Portuguese banking is, it's okay. There's a socialist government there. It's, I think, kind of correlated to some of what's going on in Europe and the West and that whole mindset. So I don't consider it to be optimal, but if you're trying to get some exposure outside of your home country, say you're in Canada, or you're in the US, you're in Australia, or something like that, it is at least an alternative that's pretty easy to set up that you can do for relatively low cost. Okay, so that's that one. Another option, which I don't love, but if you're gonna open an account, sometimes people are asking me about, what about Caribbean banks, et cetera. A lot of the Caribbean banks are quite difficult to deal with, and generally the quality of Caribbean banking is fairly low compared to some other options. But if I was gonna pick a place where I would just say, okay, put $5,000 and you've just got an option there, I would say probably K International Bank in Belize would be an example. By the way, with respect to Portugal, banks that you might be able to deal with remotely would be Caixa Geral, Atlantico, Bison Bank, Millennium BCP. If you're willing to go there, you can add Santander to that list. So, you've got, and there's a few others as well. So that gives you some idea of some specific institutions. You could also look at Lithuanian banks, various different EMIs. I've, over time, warmed to them a little bit more as places to store money. However, the downside of that is generally you're restricted to euros, and often they have some restrictions or the fees are quite a bit higher if you're not an EU resident. So it's another kind of degree of diversification that you can get. Beyond those things, some people had asked me previously about various other places like Luxembourg and Liechtenstein. Look, these are all diversification plays that you can do. These are typically pretty reasonable quality banks, and so they're options for you. That being said, doing so, usually I just don't consider them quite as good. Either the minimums are higher, so they're competing with other higher tier banks, or you're in a situation where I think that the quality banking is not as good as some of the alternatives. So I keep those 5 that I listed as there. But certainly if you want to go and bank in Luxembourg or Liechtenstein, even Andorra to some extent, etc., these are options for you. So that's giving you a little bit of a context on banking. Okay, if you have very little money, you just want to diversify easily, some quick options are going to be Belize, in particular K International Bank is typically the easiest one. These are easiest, tolerable bank, as well as going with Portuguese banks. Okay, as you have more money, go to those 5 that I mentioned. And even if you have low amounts of money, if you can visit the US, you can use a US bank, or if you happen to live or can get residency in UAE, you can use it as well. So that gives you some ideas. All right, moving on to residencies. So here's the thing about residencies, if you're using it as a backup plan. So I'm not talking about this so much as a place to move. If a person wants to go and move somewhere, great. Go choose a place that you want to move. And we talk lots about this channel about, the tax consequences and what are their lifestyle like and what are the costs like, etc. So that's a whole conversation. Here, what we're discussing specifically are plan Bs, where it's like, I'm looking for a backup plan. I maybe don't want to leave my country right now, but I'm concerned that maybe at some point I'll have to, so I want to set something up. What are some places that I can deal with? And here there's 2 main criteria we're interested in. One is we don't want to spend a whole bunch of money, have a bunch of money go down the drain. That would be bad. And 2, we want to end up in a situation where we don't have to spend a lot of time there in order to maintain it. And this is relatively few places, right? So let's take a look. On the more expensive, high end, I would say probably the top place that I would suggest for this is Portugal. If a person is in a situation where they're not an EU citizen, doing a Portuguese golden visa is just a really good way to go, mainly because of the fact that you're doing an investment, so you don't typically lose any money. You tie up some money, so there's maybe some opportunity cost, but assuming that you have, it's not a huge portion of your net worth, this is a relatively great way to go. It gives you access to the Schengen zone in ways that you wouldn't normally have. During the meantime, you don't have to spend that much time there each year. You're talking 1 to 2 weeks a year. And most notably, you have the potential of getting citizenship within 6 years. Now, be aware, and some people will say it's 5 years. It's 5 years until you can apply for permanent residency, and then you can apply for citizenship. By the time you get citizenship, it's going to be 6 years. So now, here's the thing to be aware of there. It's not a good idea to rely on the idea that you will get citizenship in Portugal. So although it's a nice benefit, and I think it puts it above a lot of the others because there's at least that open door, there's a good chance 6 years from now, we have no idea how things will have changed. So I wouldn't rely on that saying that's going to be my citizenship, all right? Therefore, let's look at some other considerations. Well, you might be in a position where you don't want to tie up that much money, right? You say, okay, it's really realistically too expensive for me to tie up all this extra cash in Portugal. You're talking about 280,000 euros minimum, usually 350 to 500,000. So what are some cheaper options? Well, you could go with Latvia. You could look at their program. You could look at the Cyprus program. Now, granted, the Cyprus program, Regulation 60, so it requires even less time. You're talking about 1 day every 2 years, so really low. And you don't have quite the same exposure, so it's not as high quality a program. You're also going to have to buy a property that's from them, which means there's some overpriced features of it that you don't get in Portugal. So generally, it's not as good an option if you're not wanting to live there, but it is yet another option to diversify yourself. Then you also have Greece to look at. Greece is probably like one of the more underrated programs, just in the sense that, look, you tie up 250 grand. Again, you're in a situation where you don't have to be a resident there, so that's great. Yes, there's more bureaucracy related to the property and more ongoing taxes and things like that. Not income tax if you're not resident there, but just property taxes and so on and so forth. So it's less appealing to own a property in Greece than it is to own a property in Portugal. However, it's accessible and it's pretty easy. You can maintain it easily, etc. So that's another option that you can look at. The big one, of course, is Turkey, because you can actually get citizenship out of that. So you buy a property worth 250 grand, you pay some legal fees, and boom, you're set up. That's pretty good. That's quite attractive in these particular cases. So those are options in terms of relatively minimal time. Another couple options would be Panama. You can buy a property for 200 grand in Panama. You could buy a property for 200 grand in Dominican Republic. Dominican Republic actually does lead to citizenship after 2 years, so that's pretty attractive, although the citizenship is very poor quality. Then you have Hungary. If you look at Hungary, you can buy a couple properties, put them in a company, basically end up tying up a couple hundred grand or something, and you can get residency there. So that's, for some people, fairly attractive. I haven't done too much content on it, but I will in the future. Talk a little. Georgia is another place that it's pretty easy to get residency and maintain it for relatively little issue. So there's that. You could buy some property in UAE. You could do something similar in Bahrain. So that gives you like a reasonable array. There's some other countries as well that you can do this, but it gives you a reasonable array. I'm going to go through in a future video. I'm going to talk about a lot of the Caribbean programs and how they work. So now, if you don't want to go with one of those, if you want to tie up less money, what do you have to look at? Well, you could look at Mexico. I've talked before about one of the things we sometimes help people with is fast-tracking permanent residency for 20 grand. So that's super easy, super straightforward, and is genuinely permanent. You could get temporary residency there quite easily. So if you're willing to maintain it, that's an option. If you go to Bulgaria, no minimum stay requirement, so you can maintain that quite easily with minimal time. You could do something similar in some place like UAE. It's more complicated because you have to visit twice and it's more expensive, etc., but possibly an option. You could look at something like a Thai elite visa. I don't recommend this as a backup plan because of the fact that you're consuming 20 grand for 5 years, and what if you never use it? If it's just a plan B, if it's not a place that you actually want to spend time, not usually the best, but it is an option. Then you can look at something like Malaysia, my second home. Obviously, the new criteria is a little bit tougher, but you could do the SMM2H, a little bit easier to maintain that one if you're interested. Again, not one that I love for a plan B because you're ending up tying up more and going through a bunch more costs, but it's a possible option. So that gives you some array of residencies to choose from, okay, that you don't typically need to spend a lot of time there. You can just get them on the books and have them. Like I said, my top recommendation would generally be to go with something like Portugal. I would say that doing something like Turkey is not a bad idea at all. I like the Mexican thing because it's genuinely permanent. Anything that I can pay once and have a lifetime of value for, I'm a big fan of that. So those would be probably my top 3 that I would think of. However, the others could also be options. I would compare Greece to Portugal if it wasn't for the difference in citizenship. You're basically not going to get citizenship. And I guess the one other that I haven't mentioned is Malta. You can get residency there pretty easily. If you want permanent residency, you're going to donate money and you're going to be out of money for a while. But that being said, it ties you into the Schengen zone long term. And so, yeah, those would be good options. This brings us to citizenships. What do we do to diversify citizenships? Well, here we have basically 2 paths, right? The one path is I'm going to work towards something over time. This is where something like Portugal is an interesting option. You actually can do something similar with Mexico, which is also interesting, right? Being able to start with permanent residency and have it evolve potentially to citizenship, and actually a pretty good citizenship. That's an option. This is where if you have any citizenship by descent, people sometimes ask me, they're like, hey, I can qualify for Italian, should I do it? I'm like, absolutely. Any citizenship by descent you can qualify for, absolutely do it. If you want help, please reach out to us. Likewise, some people can get Israeli. I was talking to some Russian people recently, and it's really tough for Russians right now. They're blacklisted from all the Caribbean programs, but some of them have Jewish ancestry, and so they can go and they can qualify there. And sometimes there's other programs that you can qualify for through ancestry. If you're going to pay, then we of course have the official programs in the Caribbean. We have Malta. We have, of course, some unofficial programs, and then we have Vanuatu. Generally, Vanuatu, I think, is just on a constant way down. It's not so attractive. There's a couple others, Macedonia, Montenegro, etc. I tend not to recommend them as much, just due to the cost for what it is that you get. And then, of course, if you want to actually be working towards places, if you're saying, okay, I'm willing to go spend some time somewhere, any of the programs that can take you a couple years to get something like Argentina, Peru, these are actually good passports. And so you may want to consider those, or obviously wherever it is that you're gonna go and live. So that would give me kind of like citizenship options to work on, barring the one thing I guess that we could add into it is, again, if you're actually willing to go live there, we can talk about places like going to Ireland and being under their non-dom, going to New Zealand and being under their 4-year exemption, etc. There's a few things to consider in those regards, as well as, of course, we haven't talked about marriage and kids and all that other stuff. This brings us to the last piece of diversification, which is about assets, or Plan B assets. So, of course, you don't want to have your income cut down. You don't want to have your assets disappear. So, physical gold, I tend to think, or precious metals in general. I've mentioned before, jewelry allows you to make it easier to travel. You can put on, $100,000 of jewelry and walk across a border when you can't carry $100,000 of cash, and you actually couldn't carry $100,000 of physical gold as well. So this is where, some people have $300,000 watches and things like that. Obviously, anytime you're looking at that, the possibility that luxury items collapse in price is possible, but at least it's something that's difficult to confiscate, and you have some options there. You could, of course, invest some in having a home somewhere else. You could have vehicles somewhere else. I know some people who they buy supercars, hypercars, exotic cars, specifically as partially like another asset that they have in one of these places, and they get to enjoy it along the way. Although, if you don't buy it well, obviously it can depreciate a lot. Then we have the importance of investing in different markets, in different currencies. I think, it's tough with currencies. There's an interesting point of sometimes people in diversifying, what they end up doing is they trade winners for losers. And that's not the idea, right? You don't want to trade winners for losers. The idea is to spread yourself out between winners. And so, for example, if I was talking about currencies, if I'm just going to hold currencies, what can I consider? Well, I can consider that I can hold pegged currencies to, say, the US dollar. And why would I do that? I would do that because my ability to transact in them, the payment rails for that pegged currency actually can be better. So this is a little bit like holding USDT or USDC or DAI, is that I might lose my banking payment rails and I still have payment rails to effectively send and receive money. This is similar if you have something like, for example, the UAE dirham, right? It's a pegged currency to the US dollar. Fundamentally, if the US dollar goes down, it's going down, but what you have is you have separate payment rails, which may make transactions a little bit easier for you. If you want to separate out from those, we have the obvious currencies that have done fairly well over a period of time: the Japanese yen, Swiss franc, possibly Singapore dollar, British pound. You don't want to probably get outside of the top few currencies if you're looking at diversification from a currency standpoint. And then finally, of course, we have cryptocurrencies, which aren't all really currencies, but definitely give you a plan B. And the most obvious one there, of course, is Bitcoin. You can have Ethereum, a few other these tokens, as well as stable coins. And ideally you can earn some yield. But yeah, that would be what I would consider if I'm thinking about plan B options for you. Hopefully it was detailed enough. If you have specific questions you'd like to talk about applying it to you, If you'd like me to make some introductions for you to various bankers, etc., please reach out to us, and I would love to see you on the next video.